Think about a serial killer. It's probably a man. Most likely a loner living in a private fantasy world. His murders are a closely guarded secret, and he's desperate to keep them that way. But there is another type. The serial killer who is not alone.
My name's Mark Billingham, and I'm a crime writer. I spend my working life creating fictional killers, but in this series I want to discover what creates those most horrific of real-life murderers, killer couples. I'm going to start looking for answers with perhaps the most infamous killer couple of them all, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. Gorton, Manchester. It's July 1963, and 16-year-old Pauline Reed is walking to a local dance. Not far from home, a car pulls up. It's driven by a near neighbour, Myra Hindley. Pauline accepts a lift, but she isn't taken to her dance. Instead, Hindley drives Pauline out of the city to Saddleworth Moor. There, Hindley's boyfriend Ian Brady pounces, raping and strangling Pauline, before together Brady and Hindley bury her. Pauline's murder marked the beginning of a hideous killing spree. 12-year-olds John Kilbride and Keith Bennett and 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey followed over the next 2 years. All four were abducted from streets around Manchester, raped, killed and buried up on the moor. Victim number 5, Edward Evans, was destined for the same grave before police discovered his body at Brady and Hindley's suburban semi and brought the killing to an end. The criminal inquiry that followed shook the nation. That anyone could abduct and kill innocent children was hideous enough, but that a couple, a woman along with her lover, could do this shocked British society.
Today, Myra Hindley and Ian Brady are bywords for evil. You certainly don't hear of too many young girls being called Myra anymore. But I want to go deeper than that. Was some dark chemistry set off when these two came together? Or were they destined to kill even if they'd never met?
I'm starting my search for answers with the partner whose crimes most enraged the nation, perhaps because she was a woman.
What made Myra Hindley so warped that she could abduct children for her partner to rape and kill?
I thought the answer could lie in her upbringing, so I headed to meet a woman who has spent years delving into Hindley's past. If anyone knew of any demons lurking there, it was Jean Ritchie, Myra Hindley's biographer.
Thank you.
I think Myra Hindley's childhood was actually, of its kind, relatively happy. Her father was a distant and shadowy figure in her life, there's no doubt about that, but so were many working class fathers in those days. She was very much loved by her granny, and a lot has been made of the fact that she lived with granny rather than with mum, but the two houses were within sight of each other. Gran loved having her there, and I think Gran and mum made up for any deficiencies on the part of the father.
So in most of the ways that count, it was a fairly typical childhood?
It was a very typical of its time childhood, of its time and place. It was working class, it was a terraced house, there wasn't much money, but it was the same as everybody else in her peer group.
So is there anything that you would identify at that time that would make her susceptible to somebody like Ian Brady?
Well, I think that she probably did have a sense of some sort of destiny. She felt she was a cut above other people. She felt she was slightly more interesting than the other girls. She was one of the toughies. She was one of the leaders of the girls.
So that's the young Myra Hindley. No obvious skeletons in her closet, and seemingly an unlikely killer. In fact, the evidence suggests she was an almost banally typical young woman when she met Ian Brady at an office in Manchester in 1961. And Hindley was as prone as anyone to falling in love with a tall, dark stranger.
Listen to some of these entries from her diary. Wonder if Ian is courting, still feel the same, haven't spoken to him yet. On 13th of August, misery. 29th of August, I hope he loves me and will marry me someday. Just 2 years later, she was involved in the most brutal murders. How did this love-struck teenager, just through meeting this man Ian Brady, turn into somebody capable of that?
The most obvious person to ask would be Ian Brady himself. Whilst Hindley died in 2002, Brady remains locked up at a secure mental hospital near Liverpool. So I thought I'd send him a letter, though I held out little hope of a reply. Everything I'd read about Brady led me to believe he was a loner, cut off to the outside world. In fact, I'd heard of only one man who'd managed to breach his barricades. In the mid-80s, an undercover journalist called Fred Harrison had persuaded Brady to tell his story for the first time. I met up with Fred outside the prison, where, across a gloomy cell, Brady had spoken of where his impulse to kill had come from.
Hindley had a very usual, certainly not an unusual childhood, quite a happy childhood in Manchester. What kind of childhood did Brady have?
For a child reared in the Gorbals, a slum in Glasgow, it was a hard life. They were very poor, and he had to fend for himself. If that's normal, then yes, he led a reasonably normal childhood, but there was emotional distance. He was an empty child. He knew that he didn't belong. He hadn't got a father figure to help him, to discipline him. But plenty of people end up leading normal lives after that beginning, except that in his case, there was some kind of a mental breakdown.
How old is he when this happened?
He was about 14 or 15. He did explain. He's cycling along. He feels he's got to get off and stand in a doorway because something's happened to him, a stroke or whatever. I can't explain it, but that's when he saw this face of death, a green image that he rationalized in terms of a face of death.
So, unlike normal-seeming Myra Hindley, Brady was a very unusual child, isolated and plagued, so he said, by frightening visions. Brady was also a petty thief, and in 1954 the Glasgow courts sent him away from his childhood home to live with his natural mother in Hindley's hometown of Manchester. Fred explained that here Brady became more alienated still, setting himself apart from the world and becoming fanatical about disturbing literature. There was the works of the Marquis de Sade, who gave the world sadism, and a growing obsession with the Nazis.
He was no longer somebody who could empathize and a stable community. He needed a kind of philosophy that made sense of the way he felt, and the Nazi philosophy offered that. Here was a regime, a group of people that were remorseless, who were willing to accomplish their deeds at any price, and he empathized with it.
She sees him and she's going, God, he's interesting, different, good-looking, which he was. What she doesn't know is that he's sitting there thinking, you just don't know quite how special I am.
All she saw was a romantic figure riding about on a motorbike, whereas he knew in his heart that one day he would ensnare her and that they would participate in his fantasies of death. And from then on, I believe that one way or another, that was going to lead to a terrible disaster.
With his deranged visions of death and ruthless Nazi philosophy, it appears that Brady was already on a fatal road with the more down-to-earth Hindley about to be swept along in his slipstream. Yet in life, as with crime fiction, things are usually not that simple.
I was about to hear a very different view of who ensnared who, a view that can be read between the lines in Myra Hindley's own words. After her death in 2002, Hindley left a macabre treasure trove of papers, including her unpublished autobiography, to journalist Duncan Staff. Duncan allowed me a look at these hugely revealing documents and explained what a psychiatrist has helped him glean from them.
She had an abnormal personality. The way it was explained to me by a psychiatrist was that there are people who will make very good special forces soldiers. They have very tough, hard personalities that can deal with violence and are used to that. And that personality can crop up in a man or a woman. That might lead to absolutely nothing, but when you meet Ian Brady, then it does lead to something.
So well, this is interesting, because a lot of the conventional wisdom suggests that she was a completely normal personality who happened to run smack into somebody who absolutely wasn't. But you're convinced that they were an accident waiting to happen.
She wasn't a normal personality. She was a very unusual, powerful personality. When I met her, you meet some people and they're charismatic, then are extremely strong. She was one of those people. She was very, very tough and able to draw people into her world and make them like her. And then when she met him, he had a script in his head. He knew what he wanted to do. She was very strongly attracted to him. So you have these unusual circumstances come together, and that then led to the relationship was then capable of going on and killing.
So, Hindley's background may have been ordinary, but her personality wasn't. As Duncan says, this was a relationship capable of going on to kill. But that doesn't explain why they turned to murder. Just what happened when these two started going out to turn Ian Brady's fantasies into reality. Saddleworth Moor, outside Manchester. These were Ian Brady and Myra Hindley's killing fields. It was here in 1963 and 64 that the young couple buried 4 children. But what drove Brady and Hindley to murder together? I'm Mark Billingham, a crime writer on a search for answers. So far, I've learnt that before meeting, Brady held crazed visions of death he associated with wild landscapes, whilst Hindley had an abnormally cold and powerful personality. And I was to learn that Hindley quickly devoted that powerful personality to Ian Brady.
Before she got involved with Brady, she was quite friendly with the other girls at work. Once she became involved with Brady, they spent all their lunch hours together, huddled together, looking at their books. She became very isolated just with Brady, and it was a very consuming, intense relationship. It was enough for both of them for a while.
So as far as all Hindley's friends were concerned, because she did have a lot of friends, she's the girl with the very weird boyfriend, essentially.
Yes, and she cuts herself off from her friends.
Already, at this early stage in their relationship, the foundations were being laid for a truly terrible killer couple, with Ian the driving force and Myra the front person, initially, for the most mundane of tasks.
She pays the bus fare if they're on the bus together. It's always her that pays the fare. If they need fags, she's the one that goes into the shop or the pub and buys them. He waits outside. And this develops, I mean, later on when he decides he wants some guns, it's Myra who has to join a gun club and subsequently illegally buy some guns. When they want to travel around and ultimately carry bodies around, it's Myra who has to get a van and drive, not Ian Brady. She's always the facilitator, the one that allows the things to happen, and she is definitely the front person.
For Brady, Hindley was shaping up to be his ideal accomplice. But what did she get out of it? Why did this girl with her average Manchester background suddenly start buying guns, reading Mein Kampf, and planning to transport bodies? I put those questions to Myra Hindley's former prison counsellor and friend, Joe Chapman.
It wasn't a big jump, you see. The one thing that she would say, if she was here now, is that they didn't just sit down and start talking Nuremberg rallies and plotting and planning robberies and murders. What they did was normal things. So you've not got this immediate sort of, but a very, very slow indoctrination. So what he went from was he went from petty crime to, you know what, we could do the perfect robbery. And then it was, well, it ain't going to be the perfect robbery because it's going to be the perfect murder.
Ruthless personality or not, I wondered why Hindley didn't run a mile when Brady started talking about the perfect murder. What made her go along with things?
So what do you think was going through Hindley's mind during this process when the ante is being upped?
What she described to me was lots of confusion, the not knowing. 1 minute there was talks of this, next minute everything was normal, then we're back to it again. But there came a point where some of that excitement, and that's the only way you can describe it, the adrenaline buzz of being a party to something that is so unreal, so bizarre, and it's us, we're the people who are going to commit this. That is what came across to me loud and clear, that there was an element of this was the difference I'm talking about, this is different.
Over 2 years, Brady had gone from talk of petty crime through buying guns and ideas of armed robbery to finally planning murder. With Hindley excited by this new, different life, the terrible crimes of the Moors murderers were about to begin, and the setting would be Saddleworth Moor. Before, they had come here to take photos with Brady's camera, get drunk and plot. Now, on the 12th of July 1963, they drove 16-year-old Pauline Reed here to be killed. Exactly what happened to Pauline would remain a mystery for more than 20 years, before a 1980s police investigation extracted confessions from Hindley and Brady. Former Detective Chief Superintendent Jeff Knupfer interviewed the killer couple for that investigation.
Why Pauline Reed? Why did they select Pauline Reed?
They were going out to abduct a child, and it just happened to be Pauline Reed. He was on a motorcycle behind her in the vehicle she was driving, and the idea was he would flash the headlights when a suitable victim came along. Right. And actually, Pauline Reed was the second child they came across. The first one was a next door, I think I'm right in saying next door one neighbour. Right. Now, Pauline Reed was a neighbour as well, but a little bit further away.
So Pauline would have known Myra, recognised Myra?
Absolutely, yeah. And of course, the moment she said, there was some discussion because she was on her way to a dance, Pauline, and of course, Myra said, well, I've lost a glove, will you come and help me look for it? So that was it. So they actually drove up to this spot here, just near the rocks there, right, on the horizon, and it was only at that stage, because Brady followed behind on the motorcycle, and of course, when they stopped, Hindley introduced Pauline, or introduced Brady to Pauline, and vice versa, and he took her up onto the top there.
Right, and so basically that established the pattern of the killing.
Yes, it did.
The murder of Pauline Reed on Saddleworth Moor was a first test for Hindley and Brady's killing creed, and it was a test they passed. Brady was capable of physically killing someone, and Hindley was able to make it happen, delivering a girl she knew into her lover's hands. Hindley later claimed in her unpublished autobiography that she was an unwilling accomplice. The evidence suggests otherwise.
The way Hindley says it is that he made me kill Pauline Reed. Afterwards, I was deeply upset about it. I was traumatised. I was very reluctant to stay with him, but I felt I had to because I felt my life was under threat. I'm not sure that's credible, and nor does the psychiatrist who looked at her work with me, because there's no evidence of post-traumatic stress disorder. She doesn't run to the police. She doesn't seem to have deviated from a normal day-to-day life. A normal person with normal tolerance of violence, when exposed to something like that, would probably go to pieces, and she didn't go to pieces. Their relationship endured.
After the killing of Pauline Reed, she could have gone straight to the police and said, and stopped it there and then. And okay, she would have been in deep, but not as deep as she was ultimately. She could have stopped it, and any right-minded and right-thinking person would have done. He now thought he could walk on water. He'd got Myra working for him. She was helping him abduct children. Because of her involvement, they abducted children far more easily than a strange-looking man could ever abduct children. You know, you bring your children up, particularly in that era, all those years ago, you bring your children up not to go off with strange men. You don't say anything about perfectly normal women.
Hindley was the killing partner Brady must have dreamt about. not only willing to go along with his murderous fantasies, but with a personality ruthless enough that she would assist him again and again. Whilst the fact that she was a woman and more socially skilled than the oddball Brady meant that she would be able to abduct far more easily than he ever could have done.
For Hindley and Brady, the murder of Pauline Reed had established a blueprint, because this killing couple weren't satisfied with committing just one murder. Their next victim was John Kilbride. The 12-year-old was picked up by Hindley at Ashton Market, just outside Manchester, in November 1963. 7 months later, Hindley abducted a third victim, Keith Bennett, from streets close to central Manchester. Both boys were taken to Saddleworth Moor, sexually abused, and then strangled by Brady. By June 1964, 3 bodies lay buried on the moor, and Brady and Hindley had become a well-oiled killing machine. Yet I was to learn that whilst Hindley was happy to go along with things as they were, Brady always wanted more. More victims, trophies of his crimes, even a new accomplice. I'm Mark Billingham, a crime writer on the trail of Britain's most infamous killer couple, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. By June 1964, the pair were in the middle of their killing spree, and 3 children had been the victims of highly organised murders. In fact, Hindley and Brady took such care disposing of evidence that it would be the 1980s before 2 of these murders were proved. Former detective Jeff Knupfer helped lead that 80s investigation and remembers being surprised by the remarkable attention to detail of Brady in particular.
I think he was probably 10 or 20 years ahead of his time. He was absolutely forensically aware to the nth degree. I mean, quite remarkably so. He drew up these disposal plans when they committed a murder, and he would have things on the plan such as count buttons. You know, all the clothing was burned, or all the relevant clothing was burned. Murder weapons were disposed of, either burned or destroyed in some other way. Oh, he was absolutely meticulous.
The idea of careful planning seems crucial to understanding Brady and Hindley. It was Brady's criminal plotting that excited Hindley in the first place, and once they started killing, their disposal plans helped them evade detection. What's more, I was to learn they even made careful plans about how to commemorate their murders afterwards.
Before the children were killed, they chose the burial sites. They then took photographs of the children after they'd been killed. They also took markers on the graves afterwards. And these photos she took part in. She posed on top of children's graves. So she was taking part in the planning of the murders, the execution of the murders, and their enjoyment afterwards.
One of the most shocking things about Hindley and Brady is just how much they enjoyed their crimes. However, as Hindley's prison counsellor told me, her enjoyment was quite different to Brady's. Where he revelled in sadistic murder, her satisfaction was that of a loyal accomplice.
I don't believe for 1 minute that there was any sexual satisfaction for Myra at all in the abductions and the killings. I don't believe that. And that to me came over loud and clear, that it was a need to please Ian, a need to do things for him, and by that cement the relationship even further.
Whilst Hindley was content to make Brady happy, the nature of Brady's crimes and the fact he kept killing suggested to me that Brady would always want more horrible trophies and more sadistic murders. And these two things came together with the most infamous of their killings, that of youngest victim, 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey. Leslie Ann was picked up by Hindley at a fairground on Boxing Day 1964. Unlike the previous victims, she was not taken straight to the Moors, but to Hindley and Brady's new home in Hattersley, just outside Manchester. Once there, Leslie Ann was undressed, forced to pose for pornographic photos, and recorded begging for her mother on Ian Brady's reel-to-reel tape recorder. After her apparent torture, Leslie Ann was then strangled and buried the following day on Saddleworth Moor.
The murder of Leslie Ann marked an increase in sexual sadism, again something that Hindley went along with willingly. Bringing her back to their home with the increased risk of detection contradicts everything I've heard about them being a meticulously planning killer couple, as did their increasing obsession with ghoulish trophies.
I wondered what to make of this contradiction, so I headed to meet a serial killer expert, Dr. David Holmes. I wanted to know too how the sordid killings themselves fitted with Ian Brady's idea of the perfect crime.
I think that you were looking for absolute sense in a situation or in a person that isn't necessarily going to ultimately be totally sane. His rationale, if you like, for the committing the most heinous, and in fact, I would imagine that his perfect crime would be even more heinous and even more degrading for whoever took part in it. You've got to remember, his ideals were things like the Marquis de Sade, where the worse it was, the better it was. And the kind of Hitlerian rule of iron, where the more harsh and the more vicious something was, the better it was.
So, Brady always wanted to go further, and Hindley was able to help make this happen. First, he wasn't happy to kill alone, he needed a follower, and through some remarkable chance, the person he found was willing and able to kill with him. Next, when the pair did murder, the killing wasn't enough, he needed to record it somehow. Then he wanted to commit ever more heinous crimes, bringing Leslie Ann Downey back to their home to prolong the sadistic abuse. Incredibly, after the murder of Leslie Ann Downey, Brady attempted to up the stakes yet again. He tried to involve a new accomplice. The man he chose was David Smith, husband of Myra's sister Maureen. But I was to learn that by trying to expand the killer couple, Ian Brady would destroy it. Today, David Smith refuses to give any interviews, so I've gone for the next best thing. Neil Mackay, a man with a unique insight into David Smith and the Moors Murderers. Over 3 years, Neil met Smith countless times for a television drama he was writing about Smith's relationship with Myra Hindley and Ian Brady.
I think it was deliberate on Brady's part to draw Dave Smith in. I think he witnessed Dave get angry and have a bit of a fight on one occasion, and as a result of that, I think there was things about Dave Smith that impressed him. But you've got to remember with Dave Smith that, you know, a key part of these events was that they lost a child, they lost a baby, and it was when that child was lost that Brady, I think, realised an opportunity. He saw an emotional vulnerability in Dave Smith that he could work on. He could particularly work on this notion that the universe is brutal, there is no God, you lost your child, you lost your baby, therefore believe in me. And Myra felt that she was losing Brady to Dave Smith and was profoundly jealous of that, I think.
Neil also explained how Dave Smith thought Brady's murderous cunning had been overplayed, largely by Brady himself. And the final murder revealed how disorganised this once meticulous killer had become.
Most of it, I think, Dave will bear out, and the murder of Edward Evans bears this out. It was a sort of shambles, it was accidental, and towards the end of his sort of killing, he became careless and casual, and as Dave has said, he was losing it towards the end.
The murder of Edward Evans was quite different to the previous four, which had got ever more sadistic up to the killing of Leslie Ann Downey. Evans was a 17-year-old lad out drinking in Manchester one October evening in 1965 when he was picked up by Brady and Hindley. Somehow, the couple convinced him to come back to their house at 16 Wardlebrook Avenue. Later that evening, Hindley invited David Smith round and deliberately led him into the kitchen just as Brady was plunging an axe into Evans's head. But Smith wasn't to join the killer couple. After helping Brady and Hindley clean away the evidence, he called the police.
That is what absolutely fascinates me, in that up to that point the killings had been meticulously planned and carried out. He cleaned up after himself with almost, forensic detail that was ahead of its time, and yet, as you say, the killing of Edward Evans was sloppy and messy. And why do you think he did lose it in that way?
He was drinking a lot. I think that he wasn't sure about whether he was about continuing his relationship with Myra. As he himself said, he once upon a time she used to stand up to him, and then latterly he would have to say to her, I have to remind her to argue with me. He didn't have to do that with Dave Smith. Dave stood up to him and in many ways became a better bet for him than Myra.
Well, despite what everybody keeps telling me about how in control of everything Brady was and how clever he was, the idea of him losing it in some way, drinking heavily, is a very compelling one. I mean, how stupid does someone have to be to invite somebody into their house, murder somebody in front of their eyes, and then expect them not to go to the police?
The Brady who killed Evans was very different to the Brady of the previous murders. This time, he had helped pick up the victim himself, so Myra's role was less crucial, whilst the killing itself, bloody and at their home, was far riskier than the previous four. Yet criminal psychologist David Holmes told me these developments are not uncommon with serial killers.
The idea that he suddenly lost, if you like, full control and was taking massive risks is something you do see amongst serial killers. They get a little bit more clever, they get a little bit more sort of aware of problems that might encounter based on previous experience, but in the same breath they become more confident. I got away with that, I can do more. And of course, being someone who is absorbed by power and control, Brady thought at that point he could more or less do anything and get away with it. But he desperately wanted a little army around him, and this was, if you like, stretching out that one bit too far to try and get David Smith in.
When the killer duo tried to become a killer trio, their dreadful little world came crumbling down. With Hindley resentful of Smith invading her relationship and the prospect of a lifetime in prison looming, it might be expected that the killer couple would turn against each other. Yet I was about to learn that exposure of their crimes to the world actually brought the pair back together and allowed them to keep the full horror of their crimes secret for 2 decades. Hattersley, an Oversville estate just outside Manchester, once home to Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. I'm Mark Billingham, a crime writer, and I've come here to find out how the Moors Murderers' killing career came to an end. I've discovered how the pair had appeared uncatchable until Brady grew tired of Hindley and attempted to recruit a second partner in crime, Hindley's brother-in-law, David Smith. But Smith was no Myra Hindley. After witnessing Brady plunge an axe into 17-year-old Edward Evans, Smith called the police. Detective Ian Fairley was one of the police officers who responded to that call on the 7th of October 1965. I wondered what he made of the killer couple at the very moment their world came crashing down.
So what did you make of Brady and Hindley when you first walked in there? What did they appear to be like as a couple?
General, local business couple, quite respectful. Brady was not disrespectful, he wasn't. No shouting and swearing or anything like that. It transpired that Hindley's grandmother was asleep in the bedroom upstairs, but there was a bedroom that was locked.
So it doesn't look like you've got Brady downstairs in his underpants, you've got the grandmother upstairs. It doesn't look like a murder scene, right?
Not at all. Not at all. The place looked clean. There was no visible, to the naked eye, there was no visible sign of anybody. In fact, there'd been anything untoward. The place looked clean. Then Brady, who was still in bed, said to her, "Here, you better get him the keys." And she then produced the keys. They went upstairs, and that's when they found the body of Edward Evans. Edward Evans' body was trussed up in a fetal position, tied up in that way, and he was in a plastic bag.
So they're cool and collected.
Right.
They know you're searching the house. They know there's a body upstairs.
They know.
Did that demeanour change when you came back downstairs once you'd found Edward Evans' body?
Well, the demeanour didn't change, but of course they knew there was a body upstairs, but they also knew the grandmother was upstairs. She was lying asleep in bed in the bedroom next door. It was like, oh, it's almost an everyday thing.
The pair, who seemed to have so utterly lost control with the wild, reckless murder of Edward Evans, had regained their composure. Ian showed me around Hyde Police Station, where Brady and Hindley were brought, and above it, the old magistrates' court, where the two were remanded. And he explained how Hindley and Brady closed ranks under police questioning.
Her favourite saying was, I didn't do anything, Ian didn't do anything, we didn't do anything, it's that Smith. That's any time you spoke to her around like that, that was the some response that you got from her. She was very confident.
And not just confident. It became clear to police officers just how unfeeling Hindley could be too, when she was played the tape of Leslie Ann Downey begging for her mother.
And if you ever have the opportunity, and you don't really want to, but if you ever had that tape where the little kiddie is being killed on the tape, there's no doubt that's what it is. I'll tell you what, it really it tugs at everybody's heartstrings, and I tell you what, it brings a tear to my eyes every time that I think about it, and the number of times that I heard it, and I've not heard it for years now, but it's still very much, very, very fresh in my mind. And she never twitched one little bit when that was played to her.
This is the Myra Hindley and Ian Brady that would be forever remembered. The unemotional slaughterers of children, soon to be seen on the front pages of newspapers around the world. In April 1966, the Moors murderers came to trial, accused of 3 murders. Edward Evans, the 5th and final victim, his killing witnessed by David Smith. Leslie Ann Downey, the 4th victim, whose cries were recorded on tape and played to an appalled courtroom. And John Kilbride, the 2nd victim, his body located by this trophy photo. The jury's verdict was inevitable, guilty, though Hindley escaped a murder charge for John Kilbride. Hindley and Brady were sent down for the rest of their lives and would never see each other again. Yet though apart, Hindley and Brady still shared one thing, the secrets of 2 more victims buried on Saddleworth Moor, Keith Bennett and Pauline Reed. 2 decades passed, with the killer couple refusing to talk about their crimes. But then, in the mid-80s, undercover reporter Fred Harrison started talking to Brady at Gartree Prison and realised that Brady might be persuaded to speak.
You always need something that's working for you, and in the end I realised what it was, and so I was able to play on that, on his Achilles heel. Which was that he didn't want Myra out of the nick. They corresponded initially, but then she decided she wanted to break away and didn't want any more to do with him and started to badmouth him. So all he could do was to undermine her mission, which was to get out. And for her to get out, she had to show that she, first of all, wasn't a willing participant in whatever happened, and secondly, even if she was now converted and a decent person, a good Catholic girl, he had to checkmate that strategy of hers, and the only way he could do it, she was complicit in what had happened, and anyway, what about the other bodies?
The news that Brady was talking about 2 more bodies, those of Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett, quickly reached the police. It was time to reopen the Moors investigation and finish the work started by Ian Fairley and his colleagues in the 60s.
Well, there's a journalist by the name of Fred Harrison, who'd managed to wheel his way into to see Brady on the pretext of being a friend. And so we got a fair bit of information from him, and we were talking to psychiatrists and psychologists, and they were all saying that they felt that Brady was really on the tip of spilling the beans. And so we came up with this idea of going to see Hindley. Now, everyone we'd spoken to, from the prison authorities downwards, had said that she's a very manipulative lady and you will not get the time of day from her. But to our astonishment, we got in there, of course, and she said, well, yeah, what is it you want to know?
Suddenly, after more than 20 years of silence, Hindley and Brady were talking about their crimes. Eventually, both confessed to all 5 killings and helped police find one of the missing bodies, that of Pauline Reed. Yet though Hindley and Brady both returned to Saddleworth Moor, this time separately, Keith Bennett's body was never found.
Was it a difficult decision to stop looking
Pull the
for
plug.
Keith Bennett?
Oh, it was, yeah. It was indeed. But of course, we'd exhausted. We knew that he was buried in the edge of a gully. We literally went down both sides of these two little valleys and excavated every single one.
Today, Keith Bennett's body still hasn't been found. Sporadically, the police search continues, with any potential remains attracting massive media interest. It's testament to the fascination that Hindley and Brady still hold on us. But what of the killer couple themselves? What of the people they became? For her part, Hindley campaigned for her release to the end, her position going from denial to apparent remorse. By the time of her death in 2002, she was the longest-serving woman prisoner in Britain. And whilst public opinion remained resolutely against her release, some argued that, freed from Brady's influence, Hindley was a very different person.
There was a side to her that I could totally and utterly 100% trust was genuine, and there would be nothing to worry about. One of the significant areas that I got extremely pilloried for was when my daughter spent the time she did with her at the age of 8 and with Myra alone for an hour. You know, I faced, how could you do that? But I could do it because I'd actually worked and I'd got to know her, and I'd separated the person that existed 30 years ago from the person I was seeing then. And I think that was being able to be the Myra she was, right at the very beginning, the good childminder, the person that people could trust their children with. That was where she was back to.
Jo's sympathy won't be shared by most, but Hindley certainly liked to give the impression she had changed. Brady has never done the same. I eventually got a reply to my letter to him at Ashworth Secure Hospital, 2 pages written by Brady. And unsurprisingly, it wasn't his victims, or even Hindley he was concerned about. It was himself.
Well, there's a lot in there. He wants me to know how terrible the regime is at at Ashworth, where he's being held. But this is the bit I find really fascinating. This is what he says. My 3 medical experts who have interviewed me regularly and extensively over the past 6 years diagnosed me as, in inverted commas, not only rational but super rational, and, again in inverted commas, intelligence-wise in the top 5% of the UK population. He seems awfully keen on letting me know just how intelligent he is, and then actually finishes the letter by saying, "The ball is yours," whatever that means.
The Ian Brady of this letter comes across as a fantasist, bragging about how clever he is. The horrific fact, though, is that his worst fantasies became a reality, thanks to his partnership with Myra Hindley. And from all I've learnt on this journey, I've come to believe that Brady not only couldn't, but wouldn't have committed such appalling crimes alone.
The 2 of them coming together, they were far greater than the sum of their parts in terms of the evil that they brought. Far greater. She facilitated him. He brought to the party the need and the urge to kill. She brought the ability to do it.
I think if they'd never met, I think Brady would have been involved in something fairly heinous, and his sadism would have probably meant that he would have turned on, you know, young boys or whoever at some point in his life. In the case of Hindley, she would have adapted, but she would have possibly adapted to someone who was not of the ordinary. She would still be enchanted by the brutal. So she would probably have ended up with somebody who was a local gang member or somebody who ran drugs or what have you. Myra wanted something more, and she was not really excited by the ordinary.
Serial killers are rare. They're certainly a lot rarer than crime writers like me would have you believe. But within that subset, if you like, couples who kill are rarer still. And everything I've learned so far makes me believe that Hindley and Brady were a one-off. Something terrible happened when they came together. Something that started off with genuinely tender feelings, I think, certainly as far as Hindley was concerned, and then changed into something monstrous. Because as a unit, Brady and Hindley were a monster, every parent's worst nightmare. You could even say that as a killer couple, Hindley and Brady were unstoppable. Without Brady's mistake of inviting a third person to join the killing, who knows how many more bodies Myra Hindley and Ian Brady would have buried under these moors.